Okay, here's the narrated PowerPoint for List 8. As you can see, we have a lot of different families this week. None of them are super important, but there are a couple that are interesting, and we'll mention those as we get to each group of plants. So here we go. Our first family that we're going to look at is the birch family. And this is not a real big family here in Southern California, but it does include some plants that you may have encountered. One that we'll cover this week is a birch, and there are also alders in this group that we'll cover. And some of the times, if you've had hazelnut, for instance, you've experienced this family. The interesting thing about these is the flowers are not very significant. They're mostly what we refer to as catkins. So they're kind of this non-flowery, very spare, kind of a wind-pollinated flower that they have. But they do oftentimes have edible nuts and then also some interesting wood. Okay, so our first one is the Ulmus rhombifolia. And the rhombus, of course, if you remember your geometry class, is a diamond shape. And so the leaves do have a rough diamond shape to them. So the white alder or Sierra alder is in this group, and it is native to Western North America. And note that here in California it is considered a native plant, but it is in wetland areas. So do we live in a wetland? Not exactly here in Southern California, with our less than 10 inches a year. So it's not super happy unless it's under irrigation. And even at that, these are not super long-lived trees. What you see is sort of a typical shape here in this picture. It gets to be sort of a large shade tree. And in my old neighborhood, which I believe was developed in the mid to late 70s, there's quite a few of these that were planted. So this plant was much more in vogue here in Southern California decades ago. But they do get to be fairly large trees. Absolutely no interesting fall color that I've experienced. Maybe a tinge of yellow briefly, and then it gets to this sort of brown color. So it's not real super ornamental from that standpoint. Here's the shape of the leaf again, kind of in a diamond shape a little bit. And you can see the cone-like fruits that develop on this. The female catkins will develop the fruits that we're going to have the seeds in it. And then the male catkins are much kind of longer and skinnier. They will occur on the same tree, so this is what we might consider to be a monoecious tree, where it has some female flowers and some male flowers on the same. But these are not conifers. They're not in that cone-bearing gymnosperm group at all. They're definitely broadleaf trees. They are deciduous, so they will lose their leaves for part of the year. So again, they do like to have a lot of water. Though there is some drought tolerance, we probably would recommend these best as used in a lawn. Fairly large size, need a high amount of water, and again there's a little bit of root problem with these, so they're not exactly the best urban street tree. However, we will find them all over the place here in Southern California, pretty much as relics from these old neighborhood plantings back when I guess water was more plentiful. Okay, the next one is another one that's, again, not well suited to this area, but you will see it in the landscape. That's Betula pendula. And pendula has to do with sort of the weeping or hanging branches of it. Now this picture makes me wonder. I think I'll get a better picture here. Okay, I think this picture is a little bit better form. It usually is weeping a bit more than that first picture that you saw, though there are some varieties like Youngiai which are much more weeping even than this one. But the idea is that you do have this sort of European look, or northern, northeastern even, United States look, northern United States look here to the landscape. So the white barked branches here, the trunks of the tree, in this case they are multi-trunked, are very attractive, and that's a very common way that you find this particular birch being used and grown in the landscape. They are native to Europe though, and again not really the best suited for this area because they do like it a little bit wetter and cooler in habitat. They will survive here though, but again they're going to need a little bit more water. They also are deciduous, which means they're of course going to leave their lose their leaves in the winter time. Okay, so a little bit close up here. Again, you've got the catkin-like fruit, or excuse me, the flower buds here. You can kind of see they're just like little caterpillars, not very showy at all. They're just kind of brief on the plant, and then they'll turn brown eventually. The leaves of these are also diamond shaped, but they're a little more jagged toothed and a little narrower and much smaller than you'll find on the alder. So again, the kind of the white bark and then the more slender branches and the smaller scale, more sharply toothed leaves are going to help you to identify these. Now these are susceptible, as we mentioned, to borers, especially the bronze birch borer, if we have that in this area, which can reduce the tree. So when the tree is under stress, too drought of an environment, too dry, it may be more prone to being invaded by these borers, which bore into the trunk of the tree. They disrupt the phloem production, and eventually what you'll end up with are dead branches. And so it'll be a branch here, a branch there, and then eventually the whole thing will just look really terrible. A lot of people like to grow this though, because it reminds them, especially if they're transplanted from back east, they just think these are gorgeous, wonderful plants, but again, they're not the happiest here in this area. Okay, here's a little bit better form of the plant, again in summer and then in winter. So, a weeping habit. Nice specimen tree, but again, not the best for this area. But it's one of those plants you're going to be expected to know on the lists for studying for certifications. Okay, Bignoniaceae family. This is actually a really big family around here, as the name might imply, but it is named after somebody whose last name was Bignon, but we just call it Bignoniaceae. It is much beautiful flowers, usually trumpet-like flowers, as you see here. It's the trumpet vine family, but it does include trees and shrubs, as you'll see as we go through this list. And the fruits are usually capsules. They oftentimes can be very long, cigar-like, dry capsules that open up and let out a bunch of different seeds. Or they can be very large and fibrous, like the sausage tree. Sometimes if we're lucky, when we take our field trip to the Botanic Garden, we'll see some sausages on the Cagellia pinnata, which is also in this family. But we're not covering sausage tree. But it's a really cool, unusual plant that you can grow in this area. Okay, the first one we're covering is the blood red trumpet vine, or Distictus buccinatoria. Honestly, the scientific name for this is not too helpful. Apparently there's 2 spots on the seeds, but we never see the seeds. But I will say there are 2 leaflets to every leaf, which is helpful. So the Distictus, the DI, meaning 2, is much more applicable in our mind anyway to the foliage of this. The typical form of this is this sort of beautiful red-orange flower, and again it's trumpet vine. It's native to Mexico, very tropical looking, beautiful when it's in bloom, nice healthy evergreen foliage, and again they're arranged in 2s. There also is a tendril on these, and the tendrils tend to be what we call 3-parted. So again, you may want to look at your specimen and make sure that you got a little tendril. But this is a vine that needs some support. Okay, so here's a little close-up. There's almost a little bit of purplish pink in this particular one. However, there is also a lavender form of the flower, which is another variety or version of this called the river's eye. So you will find that in this particular group. But it will bloom throughout the season, very yellow, very showy, I should say, yellow and reddish to reddish pink. And they're very, of course, attractive to hummingbirds. Very easy to grow, very popular in Southern California. Another tree that's real popular here is the Jacaranda mimosifolia. It's one of our largest showy flowering trees around here that has this sort of bluish lavender flower. They are native to Brazil, but they've been introduced in this area and tend to grow very nicely here. They get to be very large open trees, maybe only 25 to 40 feet high, but they also spread kind of wide. Um, Beautiful trees. A lot of people really like these because of the unusual flower color. You can grow them close to the coast or in areas where we don't have freezing temperatures, but not too far inland where we'll start to get that colder temperature. The flowers are spectacular. They're quite charming. Usually we will see them in the spring. After the leaves appear, they'll begin to pop out about this time of year, and they'll actually be in bloom oftentimes the same time as the agapanthus. So you'll have this large canopy overhead, these beautiful kind of bluish flowers, and then also you can have in the understory some agapanthus kind of echoing or repeating that color, which is kind of cool. So late spring and huge flower clusters. Some people do not like them though because these beautiful flower petals all will fall off eventually. And if it's on your car or your swimming pool or sidewalk or whatever, you might be annoyed by them. But Purple Rain, kind of cool. All right. Now, I will say though that sometimes you'll walk up to a grove of these where several have been planted on a street, and I've seen the phenomenon where one will be in full bloom, others will barely have their leaves on them, others will be in full leaf with no flowers at all. So it is somewhat sporadic. However, they do have a peak flowering period where most of them will bloom sort of in this late spring time period. However, not all of them are on schedule. It does like well-drained soil, regular moisture, but for a tree like this, it's kind of worth it for the show that you get. Very typical fruit pod, very unusual, very distinctive. It's this round pod about the size of a silver dollar. When they're fresh, they're green, and then they dry to sort of this brown color. They'll pop open, and they'll release all these little kind of wafer-like samaras or seeds from them. So that's kind of interesting. The leaf is bipinnately compound. So that is one leaf that you're looking at there, made up of many tiny little leaflets. So it's a great tree to grow for some light shade. They're not very heavy shade trees. But again, beautiful for their flowering. Another member of this group is the Pandorea jasminoides. This is another vine. Unlike the Distinctus, which only had 2 leaves, these will have a more pinnately compound leaf, and so you'll see the leaflet on this is just sort of the typical pinnately compound with maybe 5 to 7 to 9 leaflets, odd pinnate. Pandorea, or the Pandora has to do with the Pandora's box kind of seed capsule, and I'll show you that in the next slide here. But the Vaura vine, as you see here, is pink flowers, and oftentimes they'll have this little darker center spot in the throat of the plant. So it's a twining evergreen vine. It tends to twine up around fences and other structures. Native to Australia, again, can take it down to about 20 degrees, which is pretty good. Here's the Pandora's box here, as we're talking about. When the seed capsule opens up, it just has thousands of these little, well, probably hundreds of these little wafer-like seeds that float out of it. So it can be kind of interesting. They're not, you don't see a lot of fruit capsules compared to how many flowers you see on the plant, but they are there from time to time. Okay, the foliage is glossy, and it will remind you probably of the Jasminum polyanthum that we studied earlier, but the flowers are totally different and they are not fragrant. Though some types may be slightly fragrant, typically this is definitely not as fragrant as the jasmines are. But jasminoides means it has that sort of look like the jasmine, but definitely not quite as fragrant. So the flowers can be pure white, or they can be with sort of pale pink, and again with that darker center. The other variation you're seeing here is a variegated foliage, which you'll see from time to time as well. Blooming late spring to early fall, and again, it's just a nice glossy evergreen vine. So if you want to hide something, cover up a fence or whatever, this is a really nice one to have. Okay, tacomas are also in this Bignoniaceae family. Tacoma stands or yellow bells typically comes in this bright yellow color of the flower. Beautiful shrub or a small tree, can get up to 10 to 15 feet tall. I have seen it get up a little bit taller than that, maybe up in the 20s, but typically 10 to 15 is what you're going to see. It is native to the southwestern United States down through Guatemala. Does not like freezing temperatures. Now, unfortunately, the slides here are a little bit mixed up. Let me see if I can do a little arranging here. Yeah, I think we'll want to take a look at this one next. So this is the Tacoma stands flowers you're seeing here, and a little bit of the fruit, and then some of the leaflet. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8, 9 leaflets on here. But again, it can vary sometimes with that. You do see the veins on these fairly prominently, but the teeth on the edges are not quite, they're very regular, they're not very sharp. And that's going to be a distinguishing characteristic to help us out with another Tacoma, which used to be known as Tecomeria before that. So we'll be seeing that. Now the flowers can be orange. There are some hybrids of this that are very popular, and you can see one down here that's out in the trade now. So we've got some with orange jubilee or marmalade that are hybrids of this, or varieties that they've been selecting. So hummingbirds love these. They've got a nice color and nectar that especially the more orangey colors are attracted to. It's considered to be a fairly heavy feeder, so make sure that it does have adequate nutrition. Okay, the one next that's probably best to take a look at is this one, Tacoma capensis. Now this used to be Tecomeria capensis, but it's been changed or reclassified here now to Tacoma. And so it's like the other one, however, this one is from the Cape of South Africa rather than from our local kind of southwestern United States on down through Mexico and Guatemala. So it's from a different part of the world, however, it grows super well here. It's a huge either vine or shrub. We've got some I know just growing wild on our hillside back behind our house, and it doesn't seem to need a whole lot of irrigation. It will grow just about anywhere. I think I've also noticed this growing around all kinds of areas. It seems to be in bloom 365 days of the year, if you can believe that. It's all the time. Some people shear them back so they can be pruned, and they'll just pop out some new flowers after that. Again, hummingbirds love this thing. And again, you can see a little bit of difference here. The leaves are a little bit smaller than on the Tacoma stands, and they're a little bit more toothed. And you may see that a little bit closer on the samples that you will pick up. But very useful as just sort of a utility shrub that happens to bloom as well. Okay. A little bit out of alphabetical order, but we do want to cover this particular tree. That's the Tabebuia impetigonosa. You'll be seeing this, and probably have been seeing it in bloom as sort of a largish tree that happens to have pink flowers but no foliage yet, though the foliage is beginning to come on now. It's called the pink trumpet tree. So it has these pink trumpet-like flowers all over it. And the interesting thing about the foliage here on these plants is that it is palmately compound. And so these are like leaflets in the shape of your hand. It's also another one that is native to Brazil. Here's a close-up of the flowers, and again, most of the time these will come before the leaves. They tend to need to have some age on them before they bloom. There are some named varieties that are in cultivation that will probably bloom in half the time, but they probably need to be about 5-10 years old as a tree before they are beginning to show some bloom. So if you are interested in having bloom right off the bat, you'll want to be shopping for these trees then in the springtime, which is their normal blooming season. But again, a palmate leaf to these plants. Okay, so here's the typical leaf shape that you'll see. It is palmately compound, and it can have anywhere, depending on how mature the leaf is, typically 5 leaflets, but it could be as few as 3 or maybe even up to 7, but 5 is typical in this plant. So again, it's just palmately compound. It's one of the few that we'll be covering. If you remember the Schefflera that we had in the beginning, the octopus plant with the huge, very large multiple palmately compound leaves, then we had the Corycia, and that's another one with palmately compound leaves. I also do need to mention on this plant that the tabebuia has been changed to Handroanthus, and you'll see that on your list that we passed out in class. However, it's not really a catchy name that's caught on much in the trade, but it is its official name now as Handroanthus impetaginosus. Okay, next up we've got the Garryaceae or silk tassel family. And honestly, this is not really even worth talking about. However, they are evergreen plants with opposite leaves, as we'll see here with the Akuba japonica that we are studying this week. And it's called the Japanese Akuba, which is, again, not really helpful as far as determining it, but it is native to Japan, so that is true about its common name, scientific name, etc. So it's an evergreen shrub. Apparently can get up to 10 feet tall, but I don't think I've ever seen them much over about 3 or 4 feet in most of the landscapes that I've seen them in. The nice thing about these is they will grow in low light areas, so if you've got an enclosed area that doesn't get a lot of light, it's a perfect one for that, maybe under an overhang. And it likes a little bit more moisture, which is typical in a shady area. You're going to have a little bit more of that. Here are some close-up of the spotted leaves that you can have of this particular plant. Again, it's mostly just foliage. The flowers, if they're not very noticeable at all, but they would be deep within the plant, and then eventually you may find in some cases that they'll have some fruit. Not always. The plants are considered dioecious, so sometimes you'll have male plants, sometimes female plants, and typically, you're not going to have both of them in the same situation where they're not grown for fruit or flowers, so you don't typically see that. I will say back in the day when I lived in Ohio, we did actually consider this to be a house plant, but here it's something that can grow outdoors. Quite a variety of variegations on the foliage. Gold dust is the most common one that you'll see around. We used to just call this the gold dust plant. And variegata is one that's a little more creamy colored, and then picturata has much larger blotches. Okay. And so you do see these spotted laurel, sometimes as they're called, in the landscape here. But again, mostly for shady, kind of tropical looking areas. Okay, Caprifoliaceae, also known as the honeysuckle family. I believe we're only going to be covering one plant in here, so again, not a whole lot to offer you, but it does have plants in this particular family are mostly opposite in their leaf arrangement. If you remember back in probably the first or second day of class, I talked about the mad horse cap, or the dam trees, D-A-M-B, mad horse cap. Well, the Caprifoliaceae was one of those groups of oppositely arranged leaves. Again, most plants are alternate, but these happen to be opposite. So, Abelia X grandiflora, it is a hybrid, so it has that X in the name, named after Dr. Clark Abel. And grandiflora typically means large flowers, but these have pretty small, modest flowers on them, so I'm not really sure how it got that particular specific epithet there. It just doesn't seem to fit at all. But Glossiobelia is the common name of this, and you will find that very true about the leaflets. They're very shiny and glossy. Not quite like the mirror plant, but almost. So it's a hybrid. It is of Asian or Chinese origin, and these are shrubs that can get to be about 8 to 10 feet high. So they're very dense, they're very kind of loose growing, they're evergreen, and then in the season they will have these little pink flowers. Most of the time you see them getting a little bit too large, that most people buy them when they're small, think they're really nice and cute. Then they get huge and they are oftentimes sheared. And so when they're sheared, that actually cuts off the flowers a lot of times. So you don't often even see these things with flowers on them, or very sporadically. So the idea on this would be to search out maybe some of the smaller cultivars of this particular group. There's some really nice variegated ones that are coming along if you like that sort of thing. Okay, so here's a little bit of a close-up of the flower. This is a white variety here, though they are light pink to white. The leaves, as we mentioned before, are very small. They're glossy, typically about a ½ inch. I've not really seen any that are up to an inch. The new growth on the leaves is kind of a bronzy color, and as well there's a little sepal behind these flowers that's kind of this also pinkish bronze color, and those are very persistent. So even after the flowers have fallen off, that little structure still remains there. And apparently they're very attractive to butterflies, the type of nectar that they have. So it's a good food plant for the adult butterflies to flit around and visit, so it's a good wildlife one. They're actually very drought tolerant and tougher than you would imagine. They've been around Southern California gardens through the middle of California. We grew them back east. They're very tough for the most part, taking it down to -10. Occasionally we'd get it down to -25 where I lived in Ohio. In those years it would die back to the ground, but oftentimes would come back. So it was one of those that was kind of on the edge of hardiness for us. So you know it's going to be cold or cold hardy around here. So not too bad. But it will need some pruning if you get some of these large rambunctious varieties. Actually, I think this picture is a little bit better than the one with the white flowers. This is more average of what you'll see. And then it also really brings out these little sepals that are attached to them that are really very persistent, and it also shows you the glossiness of the foliage a little bit better. So this I would consider to be a much more typical picture of the Abelia. Okay, another family that doesn't really have a lot to mention about it except the loose strife. This purple one that you see here has kind of got a bad reputation because this is a very invasive plant in a lot of wetland areas. Again, not an issue that we have here so much in Southern California, but in other parts of probably Northern California and throughout the Midwest, Minnesota, and other areas. This has just kind of taken over some of the lake regions there. But we do have one plant in our group here, the Kupfia hyssophifolia, Mexican heather, Mexican or false heather as it's called. It has these little tiny purple flowers, lavender flowers, though they can be white in some cases. And you can also find some varieties of this that will have more of yellow foliage. You've probably all seen these. They sell a lot at Lowe's and Home Depot. Very common little plant to use. And again, it's kind of looks like a heather, but it is definitely much more tropical. It is native to Mexico, and it's just a nice little fine textured plant to use in the garden. Apparently good for hummingbirds. Here's a very much of a close-up of this. The leaves themselves are totally quarter, eighth of an inch, quarter of an inch, ½ an inch at the very, very most here. And if you get the variety called Itsy Bitsy, they're very, very tiny for sure. Narrow leaves here, and again, a couple of different varieties that you'll see. So Kupfias themselves are great for hummingbirds. These, however, are almost considered annual plants to use in the landscape, though they will live if they haven't gotten chomped down on by the bunnies. Okay, another one that's a good plant to know that's in this family, it's kind of total opposite. It happens to be a tree rather than a little small herbaceous plant. This is the crepe myrtle, or the Lagostremia indica. Again, named after someone with that last name, and indica meaning it's from India. However, it is from China, so, but I guess Asia, kind of close enough here. But it is a deciduous tree, so that means, again, it drops its leaves in the fall, and they are leafed out now. Though they will bloom later in the season, they bloom on new growth or new wood, and so we'll see that happening. They're a beautiful tree though. They have kind of a nice handsome trunk, oftentimes with mottled bark on it, different shades and colors, and then the sort of really profuse flowering on the new growth through the summertime. They definitely do a little bit better further inland. Here closer to the coast they tend to get some powdery mildew from time to time, but you'll see these all throughout Escondido and some places like that. Lots of different colors that they can come in, from whites to pinks to reds. The flowers do look a little bit like crepe paper flowers, and they're in dense clusters. And I'm pointing out here the fruit capsules of the plant, because once it's done flowering and these fruits begin to form, they're very persistent. You'll see those almost all year round on the plant. So when it's not in bloom, in particular, kind of in the springtime, and you're not sure what it is that you're looking at, you will see the fruit capsules very persistent at this time of year. So again, the crepe myrtle. Okay. Another weird family, not a whole lot in it. Again, the leaves are opposite. It seems like we've got a lot of oppositely branched plants this week. And the Tibucina ervillena, again named after someone with that last name, d'Urville. Tibucina, honestly, apparently it is a native name, and it's native to South America. We call it the princess flower. I've never heard anybody use the word pleroma, but apparently that is another option for you. Let me know if you've ever heard of that. But anyway, it's a beautiful kind of tropical looking plant with these vivid sort of purple, magenta, iridescent type flowers on them. Fast growing, evergreen shrub, very fuzzy velvety leaves. Takes regular water. Here's a close-up of the flower here, just kind of some spectacular ones that are out there. So velvety leaves with these beautiful flowers, mostly in the warm seasons of the year. You'll see this growing all over Hawaii and other tropical areas. So if you want that tropical look to your landscape, this is a good plant to have. New growth on it can be kind of orange, bronze in color. And again, it's got these beautiful purple flowers blooming from late spring to fall. They will bloom in the shade too, which is kind of nice. Not super cold hardy, but a little colder than you think. They'll take it down to the 20s. And they do need a little bit of pruning, a little bit of feeding to keep them in shape. So a nice little accent plant. When these guys are in bloom in the garden centers, they really do sell out. Okay, poppy family. Most of you are familiar with that group family, and it is our California native plant, the symbol of our state here. The Eschscholtzia californica is our state wildflower. These are annuals and short-lived perennials. However, they don't just stay in California. They don't know the boundaries of the state. They will be found in Arizona and all the way up through Oregon too. So they're beautiful when you can see mass plantings of them, and once you get them established in an area, they do tend to reseed themselves. Very typical cup-like shape to the poppies here. The leaves are very finely divided, and they're typical blue-green. They will go dormant typically in the summer, so we see them blooming this time of year, and then they'll sort of fade out or disappear during the dry summer season. They'll pop back up after the winter rains. So close up at night and in cloudy weather, and then they're open in the sunshine. So it's again our state flower, reseeding and making a nice kind of informal statement in the landscape. Okay, Solanaceae is the nightshade family. We know it because it's got a lot of our fruits in it that we like to eat. So things like tomato, eggplant, potato, peppers are all in this group, and as well as things like nicotine and Jimson weed. So we have some that are not good for you or kind of poisonous, and then others that we eat regularly. There are some of these that have toxicity to humans, and they can be either mild to fatal. So you do have to be careful. And in fact, tomatoes for a long time were thought to be poisonous. And some people do actually have allergies to tomatoes, but that may be they have a high sensitivity maybe to alkaloids or something. Okay, the one that we're covering in this family this particular semester is the Brugmansia, or angel's trumpet. Again, Brugmansia was named for a particular person. There are multiple species out there. We're not going to worry about which species is which. So just any old one there. And these are native to Peru and Chile, so down through South America. Large shrubs, typically, or small trees, about 8 to 15 feet tall. Spectacular flowers on them, as you can see here. And most of the time, especially in the evening, these are fragrant. So a little bit of a close-up there. If it gets below 40 degrees, okay, so they don't even take it down to freezing. So they're definitely tropical, kind of exotic in areas that are frost-free. Easy to grow. Do not eat, drink, or smoke these flowers or anything from these plants. These are considered toxic. Beautiful fragrance, though, in the evenings. Quite a few varieties of these out there, from the single typical trumpet to doubles. In other words, they have twice as many petals. Some of them are very long and slender. Some of them are wide or open, and you can see the range of colors here in the sort of cream to yellow to white to pink color family. Easy to propagate. One person told me one time, "Oh, here, have a branch." He cut off a branch of it for me and said, "Just stick that thing in the ground and it'll grow." So sure enough, it did. Took a while, but it got established and it's on its way. In fact, it's probably about 8 feet tall already and blooming its head off. Okay, next up we've got the elm family, or Ulmaceae, and Ulmus parvifolia is the only one that we're going to actually be covering. So again, it's sort of an orphan family here. Not super important to know about this particular family, but there's a group of evergreen and deciduous trees in this group that has a lot of mucilage kind of in their leaves especially. And sometimes if you pull the leaves apart, you'll actually be able to see that. The leaves on this group are alternate and have some kind of simple toothed margins, but the important thing about them is the base of the leaf that's very distinctive for many members of this family is that they are lopsided in the base, as we call it. So Dutch elm disease is kind of an important problem that we've had with some species of elms, especially the American elm. Throughout the Midwest, just about every street or in every town there's a street called Elm Street because these were such an important street tree. But because it was used so much when this disease came in, it really wiped out large neighborhoods full of these elm trees. The one we are covering, the Ulmus parvifolia, is resistant to the Dutch elm disease, so it does not have those particular problems like the American elm did. It's also known as the Chinese elm, or sometimes we call it the lacebark elm, and I'll show you some reasons why that is true. But these are either semi-evergreen or deciduous, depending on the situation and the particular climate that it's growing in. We could grow these in Ohio, so they're super hardy trees, but they definitely went deciduous there. Here they're mostly kind of evergreen, unless, again, you have the colder temperatures. They get to be a fairly large open tree, 40 to 60 feet tall, very fast growing. So if you need a fast shade tree, this is a good one for that. Close-up of the leaf, again showing that lopsided base, where one is a little bit lower hung than the other. And this actually here is what the seed looks like. So they do have a little wafer-like seed. It's not very obnoxious at all. It isn't anything that you would even worry about having to rake up. The bark does shed though and peel off, and you'll get these really unusual color patterns, very individual. But again, these are considered to be Dutch elm disease resistant, so it's important to mention that. There are some less desirable species like the Siberian elm, and you have to be really careful if you are growing or trying to purchase this particular plant that you don't get sucked in and buy the Siberian elms instead. Those are much less desirable tree. They break up in windstorms, and they're just not as nice. Now this isn't really a problem here, but back east, back in the day, probably 20, 40 years ago, there were stories of people planting these trees out, whole city streets, hundreds and hundreds of trees, only to find out they'd purchased the wrong tree. And then when they found out that they were this other messy tree, they had to actually take them all out at great expense. So it's important that you do know your tree ID when you're purchasing these trees, especially when you're buying them hundreds at a time. You definitely want to verify what the plant is. Okay, we've got the verbena family here, getting kind of towards the end here. We got, this is, I believe, our Verbenaceae is our last family that we're going to be looking at this week. Mostly we're going to be looking at kind of vines and shrubs and perhaps kind of little herbaceous plants here. Like the Lamiaceae family, these have square stems and cross sections. You can kind of twirl them between your fingers and you'll get that. They are aromatic. However, a lot of times the aroma of these can be pretty strong. Some of these members actually did move to the Lamiaceae family, so there are some close relatives in that group. Okay, so we have the Duranta erecta, which is a plant that we're going to be covering, and erecta just meaning kind of upright. So the common name, there's several for this particular plant: skyflower, golden dewdrop, and pigeonberry. And the flowers are these beautiful sort of sky blue color, and then when you see the fruit on it, you'll see the golden dewdrop connotation that they get. But they're evergreen, again, either a flowering shrub or a small tree, and they're typically from the Caribbean and tropical America. But they're very attractive, drought tolerant, and actually heat resistant, kind of quick growing shrubs. Here's a close-up of the flowers, kind of cool. Little bunches of flowers, and then the fruit, the golden dewdrops, so to speak. The leaves are evergreen in pairs. They're opposite, and the flowers are typically blue, though you will also find sometimes white, or in this case, kind of variegated, so they do attract butterflies as well. They do get to be fairly large, so make sure you've got some room for these, but they are really a nice, reliably flowering shrub. Okay, lantanas. We've got a couple of them that we're going to be covering. The lantana camara, which is the common lantana as we call it, or the bush lantana. It's much more shrubby. It's from South America, very low maintenance, beautiful flowers, long blooming. Now it does say here the height can get to 6 feet, but most of the hybrids and cultivars that we grow here are more ground cover types, so they're really great for the front of the border. There's lots of varieties out there. You can get them from kind of reds to yellows, oranges, and then these bicolors of pinks and lavenders. Lots and lots of varieties of these. The leaves are evergreen to about 1.5 inches long, and they have a very strong odor. Again, some people love it, some people don't. I will say though that if these do go to seed, the seeds are considered poisonous, the black fruits that you get from this. So even though they're beautiful, you don't want little kids getting into the fruits. So you want to avoid having a lot of fruiting. And I think there are some cultivars that are not going to be as fruitful as others. I actually haven't seen a lot of fruit on these, but most kids aren't attracted to black fruits necessarily, but you don't want to have them eating them, so be aware of that around small children. They are drought tolerant, but they will need some water. So as long as you're allowed to water once or twice a week, these will be in decent shape. Now the Lantana montevidensis, or the trailing lantana, is from South America, and this one is much more low growing and more naturally a ground cover. They usually stay under 2 to 3 feet. They come in 2 basic colors, and that's this lavender color or in white. The leaves are a little bit smaller, but they still also do have that kind of, I don't know, kind of a bitter fragrance almost to them. Very attractive to butterflies and other insects that like to sip a little nectar there, so probably for the bees as well. These, I think, bloom almost all year round around here, and they're extremely drought tolerant. They look better if they get water, but they'll hang in there without a lot of water. In the wintertime, they'll get a little bit of a bronze color to the foliage, almost kind of a purplish color. So they tend to do pretty well here. You can prune them, hack them back, whatever, and they tend to still look pretty decent. Now, both of these can be trained to look like a tree, and this is something that we would do particularly back east if we wanted a kind of a specimen in a particular landscape, and then we would just grow these just for the summer because they were not frost tolerant at all. This is the Camara here, which tends to be a little bit tighter, and then the Montevidensis, which is a much more weeping habit. But you can do this over time, just kind of train up one branch of this to grow upward and just kind of tie it to a little stake, keep it growing, and then finally when it gets up to the height that you want, a couple feet or so, then just let them branch out, and you'll have a kind of a nice little specimen plant there. So here's a close-up of the two to compare them. The Camara are very rough leaves, and they're going to be much larger than the Montevidensis. Again, more in the yellows, the oranges, the reds, very showy, much larger, more upright growing, where the Montevidensis is much smaller, narrower leaves. They can be kind of purplish tinged in cold weather, and again, lilac or white is basically the only color that you're going to see these in. Okay, Verbena lilacina, our last plant here, is actually a very nice native California plant, and this one has a beautiful sweet fragrance to the flower. So when you see these growing around, this kind of habit here that you see is just very typical of them. Beautiful foil for some of these gray kind of Crassula dudula like plants, and so they just work really well into our native landscapes and even just kind of mixed into non-native landscapes. So I highly recommend these plants. Maybe about 2 to 3 feet high and wide, full sun, very drought tolerant and useful for this area. A little more of a close-up showing you the more finely cut foliage that they have. Kind of a light green color, and again very attractive to butterflies. If they get a little bit too large, just cut them back. And the variety Delamina develops a much more uniform growth habit. It has a little bit deeper purple flowers. But the Verbena lilacina is probably one of the best flowering native plants that we have that you can kind of mix into the landscape. So pretty sweet. Okay, that is list 8.